My name is Liam, and Ryan was my best friend growing up in Colorado. We were inseparable, but our lives followed very different tracks. Ryan was the disciplined one. He got straight A's and worked harder than anyone I knew. Yet life always seemed like an uphill battle for him. I wasn't a total slacker, but I lived on a whim and followed my gut. Somehow, I always ended up with a streak of unexplainable good luck. Last winter, Ryan invited me to go hiking in the Rockies to celebrate the near completion of a major career project. I was stoked for him, and we headed out immediately. The weather was fine when we started. The air was crisp and the sky was clear. But by mid-afternoon, everything changed. The wind picked up first, and then the snow began to dump down hard. Within an hour, our visibility was completely gone. Ryan stayed calm, constantly checking his maps and trying to find our bearings. But we only seemed to drift deeper into the wilderness. As night fell, we stopped looking for the trail and focused on finding shelter. My luck kicked in again when I spotted a cabin within 20 minutes. I thought it would be abandoned, but there were already 3 men inside. The first was Mark, who looked gaunt and exhausted. The second was Daniel, a younger guy with a tired, expressionless face. The last was Henry, a small Asian man. We exchanged some polite greetings. I noticed right away that none of them had actual hiking gear. No one asked about the weather or the way out. They didn't act like hikers caught in a surprise storm. Being the talkative one, I started chatting to break the heavy silence. Slowly, they began to open up. Mark explained that his business had just collapsed after years of struggle. He had lost all his money and then his family. Daniel was reeling from a different kind of shock. His longtime girlfriend was about to marry his best friend, the ultimate betrayal. Henry spoke about being a victim of severe bullying for years because of his appearance. After talking to them, the common thread became clear. They hadn't come to the cabin to escape the storm. They had come to the mountains to end their lives. I've always been an optimist, and I couldn't just watch them give up. I stayed awake all night, using every argument and every story of my own good luck to encourage them. I told them there was still so much to live for. Ryan sat right beside me. He chimed in with a few words of agreement here and there, but mostly he just watched in silence. Before we went to sleep, I exchanged phone numbers with the 3 men. They seemed to have had a breakthrough, thanking me for giving them a reason to keep going. I finally drifted off, feeling a deep sense of relief. When I woke up, it was almost noon, and the 3 men were gone. Ryan suggested we head toward the summit to find them. He was worried that once they got back into their own heads, they might have second thoughts about living. We stepped out of the cabin into the deep snow. Conditions took a turn for the worse almost instantly. The wind was more violent than the day before, whipping snow into my eyes until I could barely see. I tried to stay close to Ryan, but in a matter of minutes, he simply vanished. I was lost in the whiteout. The cold seeped into my bones, and my hands and feet went completely numb. I realized I was going to freeze to death, and no one would ever find me. I collapsed and blacked out. When I opened my eyes again, I was in the back of a search and rescue vehicle. They told me they found me unconscious with severe hypothermia. They had barely reached me in time to save my life. The first thing I did was call Ryan. He picked up and said he had been rescued too. We were being taken home in different directions. Ever since that trip, I felt a strange pull. My mind was constantly stuck on that cabin. An unexplainable force kept urging me to go back to that mountain. My family and friends could tell I wasn't right. They suggested I go to church to pray, or at least find some mental peace. I was stunned when I walked into the church lobby and saw those same 3 men from the cabin. They walked over to me, beaming with gratitude. They said that night in the cabin had changed everything. All three of them had started therapy and were determined to turn their lives around. They thanked me for pulling them back from the edge. Relieved but confused, I asked why they had given me fake phone numbers. All three of them looked at me blankly. They insisted they had never given me any numbers at all. Then, when I mentioned Ryan, the atmosphere turned ice cold. All three of them swore that it was just the four of us in that cabin. There was no one named Ryan. Mark even mentioned how weird it was that I kept turning to the empty space next to me to talk to myself all night. I denied it, of course. I screamed that they were wrong and ran out of the church. I pulled out my phone and called Ryan's parents, only to receive news that felt like a lightning strike. Ryan had died 2 weeks before our trip. His company in New York had pulled the plug on his project at the last second. The shock sent him into a total breakdown. A day later, he went hiking alone and never came back. I went numb. I couldn't wrap my head around any of it. I sat on the curb for a long time, replaying everything. Ryan was the one who always worked harder but caught all the bad breaks. I was the one who glided through life on luck. I realize now that my carefree attitude and my constant stories about my own success must have built up a mountain of resentment in him over the years. Ryan's spirit had led me up that mountain and dragged me into that storm. He hadn't pushed me to find those three desperate men to save them. He wanted me to be swallowed up by their darkness. My death would have looked like a perfect accident. I've been living in fear for months now. As I write this, I can perfectly recall Ryan's voice and his eyes from that night. Only now do I realize just how much hatred was hidden behind them. My name is Robbie. The story I'm about to tell happened about 9 years ago. Back then, my life revolved entirely around computer screens, deadlines, and pulling all-nighters. Eventually, my body couldn't take it anymore, and I had to be treated for early-stage liver cancer. That was my wake-up call. I realized if I didn't change, I was going to destroy myself. As my health improved, I started getting into outdoor activities. Hiking became my way to build back my strength and give my mind a break. At first, I went with groups, but after a while, I started heading out alone to enjoy the peace and quiet. One day, I went on a trip just like that. I chose a trail that was pretty remote. In a section where there were hardly any footprints, I spotted a cabin. It was tucked away from the main path, surrounded by weeds that were taller than my knees. Trash, old junk, and rusty pieces of metal were scattered all over the place. The roof was sagging, and the wooden walls were rotting. It looked like the place had been abandoned for a long time. I was about to turn around and keep moving when a man in his late 50s suddenly stepped out from behind the cabin. He looked disheveled and messy, but his face seemed kind and natural. He claimed to be the owner and asked me for a small favor. He needed help carrying an old cabinet outside so he could throw it away. I figured I was out there for exercise anyway, so I'd be a nice guy and help him out. After we finished, he insisted that I stay for a cup of tea as a thank you. As we sat inside the dark, musty cabin, he started telling me his life story. He claimed he used to own a big ranch at the base of the mountain, but a business partner scammed him out of everything. He said his family had split up, which is why he moved up here to live like a hermit. I felt bad for him, so I shared a bit about my own struggle, how I had just survived a major illness and had to have part of my liver removed because of cancer. The moment I mentioned that, his eyes lit up. He said, "What a coincidence. I have this specific tea that is amazing for the liver. Let me fix a cup for you." He went into the back for about 5 minutes and returned with a ceramic mug. As soon as he handed it to me, I noticed the print on the side. It was a photo of a family of 4, but the man in the picture was definitely not him. The liquid inside the cup was pitch black, which made me hesitate. I didn't drink it right away. Instead, I told him I'd wait for it to cool down. He sat down and kept talking about how great the tea was, but his eyes were locked onto me. It made me feel incredibly uncomfortable. He He kept reminding me to drink up. But when I lifted the cup, the smell made me wince. It was a pungent, foul odor, almost like something was rotting. I pretended to take a sip, claiming it was still too hot. When he looked away for a second, I poured almost the entire cup onto the floor and acted like I had finished it. He looked at the empty cup, then looked at me. I made an excuse that it was getting dark and I had to get down the mountain immediately. He didn't try to stop me. He just stood in the doorway of the cabin, staring at my back as I walked away. The hike back down was the longest walk of my life. I had this constant, icy feeling that someone was stalking me through the bushes. I heard the sound of dry leaves crunching behind me, but I didn't dare stop for even a second to catch my breath. Near the exit of the forest, I ran into two locals. They looked surprised to see me alone and warned me that several people had gone missing in this area recently. I told them about the man I had just met. They told me that the cabin used to belong to a longtime resident, but that man had died mysteriously a few years ago. When his body was found, it was so badly decomposed that they couldn't even determine the cause of death. More importantly, they told me that the area was part of a nature preserve. It was illegal for anyone to build a house or live there permanently. When I asked about the liver tea, they told me that any herbal tea meant for the liver should be light yellow or slightly cloudy, never pitch black. That was when the reality hit me. I had just escaped a brush with death. I am convinced that man was a criminal on the run, or maybe even the person who murdered the original owner to take over the cabin. That family mug was likely a relic from his victim. That black tea was almost certainly poisoned, and he had been following me, waiting for the toxin to kick in so he could catch me when I collapsed. I thought about calling the police, but I never did. All I had were guesses. I had no hard evidence or witnesses other than two locals who only knew pieces of an old story. That experience has never left my mind. Since that day, I have never gone hiking alone again. My name is Richard. 10 years ago, back in high school, I was very close with two guys named Thomas and Jim. Those two were famous at school for getting into all kinds of trouble. They skipped class, got into fights, and hosted private parties with alcohol and drugs. I wasn't exactly a bad kid, but I was a people pleaser. I was so afraid of being seen as weak by my peers that I just quietly followed along with their reckless behavior. Thomas lived with his parents in an isolated house on the edge of town. His parents were rarely home, which made his place the go-to spot for our hangouts. Everything started on a Saturday night when I agreed to go to a party at Thomas's house. The air inside was thick with smoke, and the music was blaring so loud it was deafening. Just a few minutes after I arrived, Jim suddenly shoved a small pill into my hand. He told me that everyone should try it at least once. I held that pill for a long time, hesitant. Finally, I closed my eyes and swallowed it just like they asked. Only a few minutes later, everything began to change. At first, I felt light and floaty, as if my body had no weight. But very quickly, all the sounds around me became distorted and stretched out in a very uncomfortable way. I started hearing whispers right next to my ear, but every time I turned around, nobody was there. Then, I saw a silhouette standing in the corner of the room. I walked toward it without thinking, feeling a wave of intense anxiety. When I was just a few steps away, the figure suddenly vanished completely. I stood there, frozen and confused for a few seconds. Then, I remembered I needed to find Jim or Thomas to help me get out of this terrifying state. But they completely ignored what I was saying. They just kept dancing and jumping around. I tried to scream louder, but no sound would come out of my mouth. Then Thomas and Jim walked out of the room, and I stumbled after them. As soon as I stepped through the doorway, I froze in terror. I was facing a bizarre entity at the end of the hallway. At first, it was just a dark patch, but it became clearer as it crawled toward me. It looked human, but its body was long and stretched out. Its movements were twisted and followed no logical pattern. I stood there, paralyzed, watching it get closer. When it was about 6 feet away, it opened its mouth wide, so wide it looked like it wanted to swallow me whole. I lost all control over my body. I just stared into its pitch black mouth. Just as I felt a cold chill from the creature touch my skin, another dark shadow suddenly appeared. It charged forward at an incredible speed and slammed into the monster that was closing in on me, knocking it far away. The impact was so violent that I felt the floor shake. My head started spinning, and then darkness swallowed everything. I woke up when the sun was starting to rise. I was lying in the second-floor hallway, near the stairs leading down to the living room. My whole body ached as if I had been jumped by a group of people. My mind felt empty and dry. I crawled up and gripped the handrail to look downstairs. What I saw has haunted me for the last 10 years. Jim was lying motionless at the bottom of the stairs. His neck was bent at a sharp angle, his eyes were wide open, and his mouth was agape. Blood from his head had pooled into a large, dry stain. Thomas was sitting nearby, clutching his head and whispering something to himself. When he saw me, he panicked and said that Jim had slipped and fallen while he was high. I couldn't think clearly because I was so terrified. The police arrived and ruled it an accident caused by loss of behavioral control. Both Thomas and I were put on probation for a while because of the drugs. After that, I cut off all contact with Thomas. I transferred schools and tried to live a normal, honest life to erase the filthy memories of that night. 10 years passed peacefully until a night early this past May. Thomas showed up at my front door looking like a total wreck. His eyes were sunken and bloodshot, and he smelled strongly of booze and cigarettes, a man clearly rotted to the bone by addiction. He told me flatly that he had just caused a hit-and-run accident and needed to borrow my car to handle the situation. I refused immediately because I didn't want to be involved in any more trouble. But his attitude changed instantly. He looked me straight in the eye and said he knew exactly what happened 10 years ago. He claimed the person who pushed Jim down the stairs wasn't him, it was me. Thomas insisted he had clear and solid proof, and if I didn't help him, he would take everything to the police. At that moment, I felt my world collapse. The fragmented memories I had tried to forget began to rush back. I remembered the monster and the second dark shadow that appeared afterward. The monster was almost certainly Jim falling down the stairs. But what about that other shadow? If that was actually me in a drug-induced blackout, then there is a high chance what Thomas said is the truth. The uncertainty makes everything scarier than any actual answer could be. Thomas saw the hesitation in my eyes. He snatched my car keys off the table and drove off into the night, leaving me standing alone in my silent living room. Now, I don't know what to do next. The peace I spent 10 years building has shattered like glass. I am living in total terror, afraid of the police, afraid of Thomas, but most of all, afraid of myself. The man who might have blood on his hands while living like an innocent person for a decade.